Okay, we're this is the Bible study for Explore the Bible for June the 29th, 2014. Since the Butlers are in town for June the 22nd, we're going to skip June the 22nd and go ahead and focus on June the 29th. We'll begin again with the context of the entire book of Ezekiel. Just to remind you of what's going on in the book so that we can understand what's going on in these specific chapters. The context, our background text, the background of what we're talking about is chapters 25 through 32 of Ezekiel. And if you want to familiarize yourself as you're teaching with the background of the entire section, because it's going to be really hard. You can't understand one part of a book without understanding the whole context of the book. So this kind of helps you understand what's going on in Ezekiel at that time. And most of it has to deal with the judgments of the neighboring nations surrounding Israel. Our text today is going to be in Ezekiel chapter 28. We're just going to kind of look at most of the chapter. And here's the context of Ezekiel chapter 28. It's dealing with an oracle against Tyre and her prince, her king, her leader. And the focus is on human pride, human arrogance, and the corruption of power. And so you want to read this context of Ezekiel 28 because all this oracle about Tyre was fulfilled in 332 BC when Alexander the Great actually took his entire Roman army to Tyre and destroyed the city. And pretty remarkable accounts. Tyre was actually a city that was on an island, and there was really no way to get to it without ships, and so it deemed itself pretty protected because if you did not have a strong navy, you couldn't get to Tyre to destroy it. Well, Alexander's army actually built a bridge. Amazingly, they just heaped up earth mounds upon earth mounds upon earth mounds, and basically built an earth mound bridge out to the city and marched into the city and took it. So Alexander fulfilled the prophecy of Ezekiel and Tyre's downfall because of their arrogance and pride. Our goal today is to understand that power and greed are corrupting influences, and as Christians we must avoid using our positions of privilege that have been given to us by God for corrupt purposes. That's what Tyre did. Tyre was blessed, as we're going to see, yet they used their position and their privileges for corrupt purposes. And we should be reminded, as always, that God does indeed protect His people from the disasters He pours upon His enemies. We're going to see that. It's going to come back around to how God protects His people, just as all of Ezekiel does. You got to remember that as we go through Ezekiel, you're going to see that all these judgments, and in the middle of all these judgments, God always reminds His people that He will protect them, even in their sin. Okay, so we got 4 key points. Here's the first key point here. We need to understand that unchecked power breeds corruption and pride. We need to have balances of power. We don't need to live in a type of world or even have a type of church structure that allows one person to gather too much power, because unchecked power breeds corruption and pride. And that's what happens in the Prince of Tyre. So you're going to have somebody read verses 1 through 5 and talk about how the prince became proud and arrogant and prideful. And the prince here, it's not one specific prince, as you're going to see here. It's probably representative of all their kings and the monarchy in general. And reminder that in the biblical view of things, that the leaders are representative of the people too. So it wasn't just the prince and the king that's sinning here. It's the entire city that's sinning. Just like when the leaders of Israel led Israel astray, their prophets prophesied lies and false visions to them. God judged the entire nation because our leaders externalize our values. And so if we are to complain, for example, about the problems in Washington, D.C. and our unjust, ungodly leaders, well, they just externalize the values of our culture. We voted them, and so that they are representative of us. And so, to judge them would be to judge us because they represent us, just like the Prince of Tyre is representative of the entire city and the entire, the whole monarchy in general. So just read what's going on here. Understand that it's a judgment against arrogance and power and self-exaltation, even to the point where in verse 2 he's promoting himself as a god. Your heart is proud, and he said, "I am a god." And that's breaking of the first and the second commandments. So, modern example talking about our nation here, that unchecked power leads to corruption. There's a reason why our founding fathers understood this and enacted certain balances and protections within the Constitution of the United States to prevent another monarchy. Remember, they were rebelling against a monarchy. Remember that. So they didn't want a monarchy. So they didn't want our president or our Congress to become an isolated, unchecked power, much like it has become today. And so there's an example there of what's going on in Tyre, how unchecked power leads to unchecked corruption. How does this apply to us? Well, in the church, it applies to how we approach leadership. I mean, one of the reasons that the Bible teaches that the church should have multiple elders is to prevent one person, even a good person. You know, even maybe he's a godly pastor, a godly minister, or a godly man. It doesn't matter. We don't isolate power in one person, no matter how good they are, because that person is not Jesus Christ. And having too much power within a congregation will even corrupt good people. Okay. And so that's a key takeaway for us, how that can practically apply. Key takeaways, we want to read those key takeaways again. It's kind of summarization of those first 5 verses applying to our lives. And then you want to ask these questions here. Get them thinking about what it means to have unchecked power, why God would not want people to have unchecked power, and how we are not meant to live unaccountably. Okay, we're not to live our lives unaccountably. We need accountability. We don't need to squander our giftings. People are born with giftings that God gives them, but they can be squandered. These are things they need to be thinking about. Okay, all right. Key point number 2. The sins of corruption and pride will be judged severely by the Lord. Have someone read verses 6 through 10 and see the judgment that's going to befall the prince of Tyre and the citizenry of the city there, which was famously fulfilled once again in 332 BC when Alexander the Great took the city. And just talk about how God punishes. If people remain in unrepentance, God punishes them, and God is right to do so. What does this apply to us? Well, one of the reasons people become prideful and arrogant is that they forget that they must give an account for everything that they have done. When we forget that we have to give an account for our actions, we will live unaccountably. Yeah, but listen to what Jesus said. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. We'll give an account for everything. So if God judges even careless words, how much more severely will He judge wicked and corrupt actions that stem from pride? Thus, our takeaway, we need to be very careful how we live, how we conduct ourselves, how we speak to one another, and how we use our God-given giftings and the privileges that God has given us. If we use them for corrupt purposes, God will judge us severely. And read those key takeaways there, which kind of reinforce what we talked about there. And then ask these questions. Do you think God is too severe toward Tyre and their prince? Do you think that's mean? Do you think God is mean for sending unbelievers to hell? Why or why not? Do you think God's wrath is only reserved, for severe sinners? Is it just bad people, really bad people? Or is it anybody, even people who do small, little, tiny sins that refuse to repent? Will they be judged just as severely as the prince of Tyre? And then should considering that even great men are accountable to God, should any person, no matter their position in life, consider themselves better than someone else? Is that even a biblical trait to look down upon others, or to treat others as better than or less than yourself? And why not? Okay. Key point number 3. We should not rejoice when wicked people are judged. Okay. We're gonna have someone read verses 11 through 19, which outlines. First of all, outlines the blessings and the good things that was given to the king of Tyre. How he talks amazing things, even very strange things about him being in the Garden of Eden, how him being anointed as a garden cherub, how he walked in the midst of God. Very strange things, but all this pointing to that this is someone of importance. It was someone that was intended for good, and he strayed into evil. And so let's look here what's going on. Ezekiel's oracle recounts the privileges and blessings that the prince of Tyre received from the Lord. Now, some theologians see the prince of Tyre as representative of Satan. You can see that in the Garden of Eden and the angel, and you can see some of the corollary in Satan's arrogance and his pride. He was an angel of light, yet his corruptive desire for power uh, marred him and cast him out and forced his being cast out of heaven. And so the Prince of Tyre and the sin of Tyre kind of pictures that. They'd been strategically placed along the Mediterranean coast to receive so much wealth and prosperity from the trade going up and down the coastline there. They kind of oversaw that, so they were very wealthy, yet they squandered it all, and that was a very sad thing. It's a very evil and sad thing. It's nothing to rejoice over. The whole chapter is a lament. It's a crying out. It's a sadness. It's an expression of sadness. And here's the example I thought of when I read it. I thought of the night I remember watching in my house the news that Osama bin Laden was killed by Navy SEALs in Pakistan. I remember that, and I remember rejoicing and just like very happy. And then I had to think, there's a sense in which we rejoice in the judgment of God over sinful people and wicked people. That there's a sense in which the judgment of God is very good, but we don't rejoice that people have to be judged. Does that make sense? We don't rejoice that people have to be judged. Though we rejoice that God does deal with sinners and He punishes them and even sends them to hell. There's a sense in which we're glad God does that, because unrepentant people should not be allowed to go to heaven. We don't rejoice that it's necessary. So we should be sad. We should be sad that sin exists. We should be sad that sinners remain unrepentant. We should be sad that people have to go to hell because of their hard hearts. And why is that? Well, the reason is because all people are created in the image of God. Everybody. Even the Prince of Tyre, even Osama bin Laden was created in the image of God. And that means that there was value to him. Though it was marred and it was destroyed by his wickedness and his hard-heartedness, it doesn't change the fact that he was created to worship God. He was created to live in response to his Creator. And that he didn't do that makes it that much sadder. Makes it that much more perverse, makes his sin that much more worse. And so we are not to rejoice that evil people will go to hell. We are instead to mourn that the image of God in man has been so marred or destroyed that the height of God's creation, which would be a human being, can commit such acts of evil. And so we don't rejoice when sinners are destroyed. We don't rejoice in that at all. Even though we rejoice in the justice of God, we don't rejoice that sinners have to be destroyed. Key takeaways is just what I said, read those. And just these questions kind of help people think about, what does this mean about the preaching of the gospel? If all people are made in the image of God, should all people have an opportunity to hear the gospel? And if so, how should that change our view of the priority of missions? Okay? And read these other questions here. And our final key point, this wasn't a text that your book had you read, but I think it's very important to kind of close the section out. It's verses 24 through 26 of chapter 28. Have someone read that. But it's a promise of God's protection of His people, that they're not going to face the same judgments that the wicked peoples face. And that I don't know why the book didn't include that, but I think it should have, because it's a reminder that God does protect His people, and His people are treated differently, even though they sin just like the world does, and they have struggles just like the world does. None of us are perfect. God treats us differently. Israel was punished. Read what's going on here. Scattering was a primary judgment on God's people in the Old Testament. Have someone read those two verses maybe and remind them that that was what God warned them. If you sin, I'm going to scatter you. I'm going to push you away. But we see in this passage that God's gathering them back. Right? He's gathering them back, which is a sign of full restoration and recovery from their sins. Well, how does that apply to us? Well, we can often be tempted to think that everything is hopeless and everything is in disarray. We can always think that, nothing is getting better. Imagine Israel seeing all these things happen around them and themselves struggling and going through all these trials because of their own sins, and thinking the world is only going to get worse. And in the middle of that, right in the middle of these chapters, is these 4 verses right here that's saying, no, I'm going to restore you. And I'm going to fix you, and I'm going to make you holy, and I'm going to be good to you, and I'm going to gather you back into the land. I'm going to undo the effects of your own sin. Well, that's an encouraging thought. That's a very encouraging thought, that God's not done with us, and we don't have to have a hopeless view of our future. We don't have a hopeless view of the prospects of the church. All is not lost. God will vindicate His people, and Christ will reign, and the church of the Lord Jesus Christ will triumph in history, not just in heaven, but here. And no matter how bleak our present prospects may appear. So we don't judge the future hope of the church and the world based upon, the contemporary news outlets and the negative spin of the world. Yeah, the world is really rough right now, but it was rough back then too, and God, in the middle of all that roughness, reminded them of the hope of the gospel and the hope of their restoration. Okay, so key takeaways. I think those are the key takeaways. Read those and then ask these questions. Close with these questions. Hey, do we have a right to be optimistic? That's what you need to be thinking. Do we have a right to think that the gospel is going to triumph and that people are going to come to the cross from every tribe, tongue, nation, and land? We have a right to believe that the world isn't spinning toward destruction and death, but toward the rule and reign and the peace and prosperity under the lordship of Jesus Christ. A lot of Christians have a negative outlook on the world. Many, I personally, have a very positive outlook on the world. It's because I derive my view of the world not from the news outlets, not from my present contemporary circumstances. We should derive them from the Word of God, which does foresee a mass ingathering of Gentiles and Jews into one church. And so we should have that hope. And kind of close with that. If you have any questions, once again, give me a call. I hope this is very helpful for you. Thank you.